Christina, we are here at the delegation of the European Union in Havana. We are basically the embassy of the European Union as a whole. We exist together with 18 embassies of European member states.
So that's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work because we are the permanent responsible entity for all those other embassies. So we have to constantly to deal with 18 ambassadors, 18 embassies with different personalities and agendas. So it's a challenging job.
Let's talk a little bit more about that.
Sure.
So, Ambassador, this is not your first time in Havana. I know that you were an ambassador of Belgium and now you're back. Did you choose to come back or were you appointed?
Well, I arrived here for the first time as a diplomat in April 1995. That's almost 20 years ago, working for Belgium, as you said. And the coincidence is I live just across the street on Quinta en 24. So my joke is that in 20 years' time I just managed to cross the street. I had to apply for this job. I was sort of at the end of my career in Belgium. I was over 60. And I had an interesting career, but there was nothing much left for me to do that I found interesting or challenging. And then this posting became available. I'm working for what we call the European External Action Service, which is the diplomatic branch of the European Union as a whole. It's a fairly new institution, so I'm also part of an ongoing process to make this work. I had to go through a recruitment process, which was fun because I was in my 60s and I had to sort of study my subject again and go through interviews and all that. And I think partly based on my experience in the 90s, because I knew Cuba. I know Cuban society well because I have many friends here with whom I always stayed in contact even when I was not working here. And of course you had to speak Spanish. And based on I think on my experience and the idea I had of how things could go between the EU and Cuba, I got the job. But I had to go through a whole recruitment process.
You are also a writer, ambassador, and you've even used Havana as a motivation to write. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I've been a professional writer since the mid-1980s when I started to publish commercially back in Europe. My years in Havana between 95 and 99 were very inspiring because it was a very interesting period, difficult in many respects, periodo especial, many economic problems, but also an enormous survival capacity that became apparent because I remember when I was coming here first, people in Brussels and in Europe said, well, you know, the system is going towards its end, you're gonna live many changes. What I found was this capacity to adapt and to survive. And since I know the Caribbean well, because I've also worked in Jamaica, I came to see Havana as really a focal point for the whole history of the Caribbean. And I wrote a historic novel set here in 1767. Very specific point in time because it was just after the British occupation and Cuba started to opening up to the world and started to emancipate itself from Spain, basically. And it's actually the only book so far that I've written directly in English.
Let's talk a little bit more now about your job as an ambassador and the priorities that the European Union, this delegation has here in Cuba. Why are you based here? What are your main tasks?
Well, I'm a political diplomat first and foremost. That's been my whole career. So my first role here is to facilitate a normal political relationship between the Europeans and the Cubans. And that has various aspects. My mantra is we have common challenges, as you've seen, desafíos comunes. We stand for a long-term model of Cuban society, which is not just a freer economy, but also social justice. And that is our main agenda here. Of course, we have differences on the political front. We believe in multi-party systems. We believe in a more open society. But we are discussing those issues with our Cuban friends. And my other mantra is it's always better to talk with Cuba than about Cuba. And I think everybody is coming around to that conclusion.
You've said that the European Union is ready to back Cuba in its move to attract foreign investment as part of the update of our economic model. What potentials do you see in this new approach that Cuba is developing towards economy?
Well, my message to my Cuban friends has been in several points. First of all, yes, you do need a lot of foreign investment. A lot of things have to be updated and renovated in this country. And we can do that as soon as we have the financial means available and all that. We're doing that already on a smaller scale with development projects, but we have to do it on a commercial basis, and that still is a challenge. The second point is to attract foreign investment, and especially in this part of the world, it's very competitive. We have Marielle, but we have had such free zones in other countries, and they're based on, it's a horrible term, on comparative advantage. It means, what do you have to offer? Educated workforce, yes, but you need energy, you need transportation, you need infrastructure. So you have to be competitive to attract investment. Once we have all the conditions there, Europe is very interested, not just large companies, but also smaller and medium-sized companies that are interested in the Cuban market of 11 million. On the other hand, let's also look the other way. We are a market of 500 million people in the European Union, and Cuba so far is exporting mostly traditional products. That's tobacco, rum, nickel, lobster. We can do much better. Cuba has potential to create products with much more added value that also create more jobs, and we also try to assist with that, look at pharmaceuticals, biotech products, etc. So it has to work both ways. And last point, of course, at the moment when Cuba is starting to open up with the United States, it's in everybody's interest that we keep it balanced, that in the Cuban economy, especially in investment, Europe, Latin America are also present, not just to create new monopolies.
This position that you were talking about, how Europe is welcoming the update of the economic model, what does this have to do with the common position that the European Union has had towards Cuba? Is that changing? Is that debated inside the community?
Oh, most definitely. The common position dates back to 1996. So it has a very specific moment in history. It still defines an umbrella of political principles, but under that umbrella what we're looking for is a pragmatic approach. What can we do without changing our principles? We won't change our principles. We still stand for democracy and human rights and an open society. But in the meantime, what has happened? We started to have tourism, we started to have investment, and many of the member states, more than half now, have their own agreements with Cuba, which coexist with the common position. What we're trying to do is bring the two tracks together. We have the political principles enshrined in a common position, and then the pragmatic approach taken by the member states. It's very simple. When you have 1 million tourists here from your country, you cannot just defend political principles. You need cooperation. You need legal cooperation. Airlines have to cooperate. You need technical assistance. And all those things are outside political dogma. We have different visions of society, but we have to cooperate because we become partners. And we try to make those two roads converge.
And do you see that common position changing or being removed in near time?
Well, the present position is that it will go away once we have an agreement on all the topics that we're now talking about with our Cuban friends. And we are in the third stage of that negotiation.
There will be, and you're talking about that, another round of conversations between Cuba and the European Union. And there's a lot of expectation by the media and the people from both sides of the ocean about this. Which will be the main topics you will be talking about in March when you'll have the next rounds?
Well, the first thing that's on the agenda is cooperation. We do quite a bit of it already. We have like 50 million euros we spend over the next 5 years. And we have to redefine and define the priorities. It's basically food security and trying to make agriculture work better. Secondly, to help Cuban administrations adapt to a new economy. And that's a very important program for me because we come from a totally centrally planned economy to an economy that will be more mixed with more private activity. Also climate change, and there's a lot of cultural elements in there as well. For instance, we just finished the restoration of the Palacio del Segundo Cabo in Havana Vieja, which is a beautiful project. We're going to make that into a cultural meeting point between Europe and Cuba. We're working on that. Then next we have to talk about trade and economy, which is very important now because, as I said previously, when Cuba opens up more to the United States, we want to see that our companies and our banks can also work normally in Cuba, which is still complicated. And also to encourage more trade and more diverse trade between Europe and Cuba. And then, of course, we come to core issues of human rights, democracy, governance, which obviously are the more difficult issues, where we will not agree on many things. Our first demand is that we should be allowed to have contacts with the whole of Cuban society. And that includes points that are still very difficult because, as you know, the Cuban government has a very specific view of what is civil society. We see it much more broader. So we want to talk to religious groups, also to think tanks, to intellectuals who may have different visions of the future of Cuba. And that is still a very sensitive point, but we're talking about it.
What results do you expect then of these rounds? Would you say that after this one we could talk about normalization between the European Union and Cuba?
Well, we don't come from as far as the United States. All our member states, 28 now, have full diplomatic relations with Cuba. As you know, 18 are represented here physically. A number of others are represented out of Mexico and come here frequently. So we have a good diplomatic presence. So in that sense, we are normal. Also, the EU as a whole, my organization, has full diplomatic relations. So we don't come from as far as the United States. So normalization is a different concept for the United States than for Europe. What we want basically is greater freedom of movement as diplomats, to talk to the entire society. And if that is a result of the next round, we will be very happy.
What's the opinion of your delegation and your superiors about the intentions of establishing diplomatic relations with the United States and the dialogues that happened recently between the two governments, United States and Cuba?
Well, it's history, and of course I was very enthusiastic living history here, and the more so because I had also lived 1996 here when the embargo became actually tighter. So I was very happy to live another moment going in the right direction. It will take a while, obviously, but on the other hand, it opens doors, it opens an horizon. It created a lot of emotion in Havana. I was struck by how emotional the announcements were received by the Cuban public, where you could see that the relationship with the US is very peculiar, because what came out was practically pure love and affection, in spite of politics and official frictions. And I think it's normal. You're so close. It's family, and it's complicated because it's family. It's sort of human nature to have these two things. The closer you are, the more you know each other, the more painful certain things become. And this has been a very complicated family relation, at least over the last 50 years and longer. So it's normal that it's complicated. But what struck me most was the amount of emotion that came with it here. It was actually very beautiful to witness.
So what's the opinion of the, not only yourself, but for example, the business community in Europe about the potentials that United States and Cuba may be closer in this sense?
As you know, the US has sanctioned European banks for doing business with Cuba. There is a certain anxiety with European businessmen and banks, but not only in Europe, also in Japan, for example, that the new situation may facilitate things faster for US companies and banks than for our sector. So we have to talk about that, because we want to see it develop in parallel and in a balanced way.
That's the contradiction that, for example, now would be allowed probably the fact that transactions in dollars will be possible and legal between the United States and Cuba, but not because of the laws, the regulations of the United States of the blockade will keep being illegal to do it with other countries, with third countries like Europe or Japan.
Well, I understand that as of the 16th of January, US credit cards are already working here. Now, our credit cards have always worked. So at the level of the individual traveler or tourist, it's never been a problem. The problem is for major European banks that want to finance bigger business with Cuba and have sometimes been sanctioned for that. And that we have to talk about, because it creates an asymmetrical situation. And it's in everybody's interest. I don't think the US want to monopolize this economy again. And certainly our Cuban friends in the government also want to see a balanced economy where we are present, where Brazil and Mexico are present, where we have a mixed presence, certainly in investment.
Would you predict that the relations between European Union and Cuba will be better after these dialogues with the United States. For example, Madrid recently opened the Iberia direct flights to Havana. Probably there will be an interest of the business community in Europe. Do you predict that we will be closer after these dialogues?
I think it's an accelerating factor, and I think we will all benefit from it. When we can do away with the problems, especially in the banking sector, that's going to be an issue we have to talk about. And of course, we're looking at a different business profile. US companies are very close. Also Brazilian or Mexican companies are close. If they want to come and manufacture, they have a market, and they have markets nearby. When a European investor comes, they may be interested first and foremost in the Cuban market, which means it may be smaller and medium-sized companies. But that's very important because in Europe it's the small companies that create most of the employment. And given the employment situation in Cuba, the faster we have small companies starting to operate and to work and cover the market, the more employment it will create. And that's, I think, a crucial factor.
You mentioned that one of the issues that will be discussed in the following rounds is something which is very controversial in these conversations. You talked about the human rights and the vision of the European Union delegation and the vision of the government of Cuba. And I want to know your opinion in another sense that has to do with this. If you look at Cuba, Cuba is towards, if you compare it to other countries of Latin America, a very peculiar country, the most literated country in a region. Everybody knows how to read and write. The certain well-being that we have towards certain services that are guaranteed here in Cuba, like education, like healthcare. And one of the consequences is what you said, the result of having a very well-educated labor force. In which way do you think this topic could become an obstacle or a stone in the way in this round of conversation? Is it a condition that European Union is putting or just something that is being debated?
I don't like the word condition because I don't think Europe or any other continent is in a position to lecture other countries or continents. We have had our own history and we should also look at what we've done wrong. I'm more of the opinion that we should exchange ideas and see what has worked best for several societies. Of course, we have fundamental differences, but on the other hand, given the successes of the last 50 years, we don't want to see wild capitalism come here and do away with social benefits. What we try to bring across is look at the European model. It's under a lot of stress, admittedly, but we are still an open economy with a strong social agenda, as is Brazil, for instance. And that's important. We try to discuss with our Cuban counterparts, how is this possible? You have a certain demography, you have an aging population, which means your healthcare system is becoming very expensive. How are you going to finance it? How are you going to give people access to affordable food when the market opens up? Those are things that we know probably very well how to handle, in spite of our problems. Again, I'm not here to lecture anybody. I don't hold the final truth on anything. But we have to exchange and talk and see what has worked for us. And there has been there's a lot of speculation that the European model is dead and we're all neoliberalists and whatnot. This is not really true. We're struggling to keep a social sector alive. But it's a heavy debate in the EU. But anybody can benefit from that debate. So we are still a model that our Cuban friends can look at for the future, how they see their own society 10, 15, 20 years from now, trying to save everything that has been achieved over the last 50 years. And change will come unavoidably. In politics, never say never. Everything has to change, everything adapt, because the world changes and societies change, and you have to live with that.
In a moment, Europe and Cuba were very apart. You mentioned the moment of, for example, in which the common position was established, promoted by José María Aznar, the head of the government of Spain in that moment. And the political differences were very profound back then. And in a way, Europe and the position that in that moment the politicians accepted or created or established affected the Cuban people because the economic relations were colder since then. Do you think that coming in the future, or do you think that we're getting closer?
Yeah. Well, it was a mixed picture because I was lucky to work as a Belgian diplomat back then, and Belgium always had a very good relationship with Cuba. We had a bit of problems. I came here to settle a difficult situation. But Belgium, being very open-minded, always had a very good position, even within the European Union, between several positions. We were often the go-between. What happened as of 95, 96, with the opening up, countries like Belgium, but also others, especially the Mediterranean countries, started to bring tourism, started with air links, started with academic cooperation, big time. One of the things I did as Belgian ambassador was to start working with the universities here, not just in Havana, but also in Oriente, throughout the country. Because I realized in a difficult situation, you're going to lose access to literature, to software, and the scientists and the academicians, academic people here had to stay the level where they were. So we helped out a lot with that. So it was a mixed bag. Some countries were much more cooperative than others. By and large, if you look at the relationship now, since the mid-1990s, we are the second trading partner of Cuba after Venezuela, which is because of the specific links. Venezuela is still number one, but the EU is number two. We are responsible for about 30% of investment and tourism here. So relationship has bloomed in spite of the political differences, because it's not because the politicians say one thing that the society does it. By and large, what happened in the 1990s, there was an enormous sympathy for Cuba, an enormous interest in coming here and seeing what it was like. Everybody knew the images, the mythical images of the 60s, but people wanted to come and see what it was like. And that has been ongoing. And those are the personal relationships that have developed as well. And those things go, it's people to people, which is sometimes the better diplomacy than what the politicians or we diplomats can do, because that's where it's real. And that has brought Europe and Cuba much closer, I think, in spite of politics, since the mid-1990s. And I was happy to be part of that in 95, 99.
Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Thank you, Cristina.
It's been a pleasure.
A pleasure, thank you.
Thank
Muchísimas
you.
gracias.